Alright, hello everyone, welcome to this video, and I have a very important topic in store for you today. I'm going to be talking about keeping the tension, and some of you may not know what this is, but I'd say past the pure beginner stage, this is one of the most common mistakes that I see people making. And so I'll just give a very simple example to start off with to show you what this is all about. So let's say, probably the most common one I see actually, on a beginner level, and kind of maybe like early intermediate, I guess you could say, is in the Scotch opening here of d4 takes, and here e takes d4. This is kind of what we'd be calling releasing the tension, but it's not exactly a move I would criticize either, since there's no real way black can keep the tension in this position while not getting run over by something like d5 or just simply lose a pawn to d takes e5. So taking is the best move here, takes, but it's in this position I see so many people taking here on d4, which is just really not a good move. The two best moves here, if you know any opening theory here, a knight f6 and also bishop c5. Taking on d4, however, this allows white to bring their queen to the middle of the board, and usually say in this position, for example, d4 takes, the queen is in the middle of the board but can be easily kicked around by a move like knight c6. However, when we look at this position now after knight takes d4, queen takes d4, since this knight on b8 has already traded itself off for our knight in d4, that's no longer possible, and if black has to resort to something like c5 to kick the queen around off its very active square, now weakens the d5 square, and after something like queen e3, we have simple developing moves like knight c3, bishop c4, and the light squares in this diagonal is just really weak, and black's going to have a really hard time defending this position. And this kind of provides a nice introduction to the topic with keeping tension. It's like, okay, in some situations like this, inevitably you're going to have to do what we'd call releasing the tension by playing a move like e takes d4. But then very often you have situations like this where you don't have to play a move like knight takes d4, and you can do what we'd call keeping the tension, just letting these knights kind of attack each other, and meanwhile just developing your pieces with moves like knight f6, or kind of just adding pressure to this knight here by trying to like force it to release the tension with move like knight takes d6. This is another very important technique in kind of keeping the tension, trying to get your opponent to release the tension so they can improve your position for you. But anyways, without further ado, let's get into some more kind of advanced examples. So I'm going to be looking at the Royal Lopez, which is one of the most popular openings in chess and one of the most important openings in chess. And we have these moves which are all pretty basic standard theory. We get the position here where after c3 white's aiming to play d4 and break in the center. Here black can play what we call the Marshall Gambit with d5, but that's another topic in of itself. d6, kind of more kind of classical stuff. d4 here, and basically d4 isn't exactly the best move. Theoretically, h3 is considered a little bit more critical because after d4, bishop g4, this pin is a little bit annoying, but I thought this would be a good place to start in terms of demonstrating some ideas here. So basically, with this sort of tension in the center we have right now, white kind of has this very annoying situation where this bishop is pressuring this knight here, which is defending this pawn, and this kind of makes it so white is playing move like h3, for example, after takes. We would have to take back the g pawn more or less if we didn't want to lose material, because after queen takes f3, e takes d4, white is just losing the pawn more or less, and this is obviously something that we don't really want to go into. And so a lot of people might be tempted actually to play a move like d takes e5. Well, and this is again releasing the tension in the center. But the problem is after a move like knight takes e5, the black knight activates itself from the c6 square where it wasn't really doing much. It was restricted a lot by this pawn here on c3 and also d4. And this movement was very limited. But now it comes to this very active e5 square. And again, it's like you don't really want to allow this sort of trade here where you give up this very nice central pawn and also simultaneously allow your opponent's piece to come from a bit of a passive square to a very active one where it's now increasing the pressure of this knight here on f3, and white probably has to play something like knight bd2 here, defending this knight here so we don't get double pawns in front of our king. But this is rather passive here, and I'd say black is doing pretty well. One thing black could consider is to play something like knight d3, exploiting the fact that we had to put our knight on this d2 square, and also making use of the fact that because it was an e5, it had access to these squares deep into our territory like d3. Coming back to this position, however, another very common mistake here is to release attention with a move like e takes d4. And compared to the other position we saw on the Scotch, where white could only recapture back the knight, here we can recapture back the pawn, and here black gave up their e5 pawn, which is a very important central pawn, for our pawn c3, which was a lot less kind of active and whatnot, but now it's replaced our pawn in d4, so this exchange has clearly favored white, and now not only that, but our knight doesn't have to go to d2, it can come to the much more active c3 square, and hence white has a very nice position here. If black tries the same idea with bishop g4, we can just simply develop our knight with c3 actually, and we don't even care if black takes, so we can actually take back the g pawn here, and these double pawns aren't a big deal because we have this very nice central control. Also, one last inaccuracy is very common in the Roy Lopez sort of structure is in this line here with h3 and the knight b8 here. This is what we call the Brea variation. As we mentioned earlier, the knight in c6 is actually not that well placed because it's very restricted by the c3 pawn here. And so very often what people do is they'll try to reroute the knight to d7 and maybe put it on the c5 square. Although after d4, knight b d7, it isn't so easy to play a move like knight c5 because this pawn on d4 is restricting the c5 square. And that kind of brings us to a very common mistake, which is to release the tension not by playing d takes e5 here, although that is, once again, not very good. After d takes e5, white has given up the d4 pawn for the more active d6 one. And another very common mistake, though, apart from d takes e5 here, would be to play d5. Again, this releases the pressure off the d5 pawn here now, and it makes it a lot easier for black to gain counterplay, because they can play a move like knight c5 here, since white gave up control of the c5 square when they pushed the pawn to d5. And not only that, but they don't even have to play knight c5, they could delay that and instead play something like bishop b7 and c6, immediately gaining counterplay against this d5 pawn, and black has a very nice position here. Instead, once again, what white should do is they should keep the tension in the center, keep developing their pieces with moves like knight b2, bishop b7 will come, knight f1, rook e8, knight g3, and just kind of continue playing this very sort of typical Roy Lopez middle game, where sometime in the future they may play d5, but what we typically do is wait for black to play c5, maybe here for example, so that after d5 here, it's not as easy for black to just play c6 and gain counterplay against his pawn here because of course pawns can't move backwards. Alright, so the second example I'm going to be showing is very prevalent in many d4 openings. So it could occur, for example, in this opening here, this semi-Slav defense. It could occur via several different move orders. This one is very common at the top level, maybe less so on low levels. And here you will notice we have tension between the c4 pawn and the d5 pawn. And in this position, it would definitely be a mistake for black to take here immediately, allowing white to just simply recapture back the pawn here, and black essentially just gave up their very important central pawn for our less important c pawn, where here now we have this 2 versus 1 advantage with central pawns, and white has a very nice position. So instead what black should do is play knight bd7, and here white actually has a variety of different moves. They could play queen c2, or b3, or bishop d3, and maybe there are some other moves as well, but those are the main ones. And with bishop d3, here now it is considered best for black to take here, but when we compare that to that position after bishop d3, d takes c4, here white has already spent a move developing the bishop to this d3 square, so now it's a lot more justified for black to take, since it takes 2 moves for white's bishop to reach the c4 square. And now what black will very often do is they'll play a move like b5, gaining counterplay against bishop once again, gaining another tempo. Now it's something like bishop d3, bishop b7 is very common, and black will try and play a6 and c5, gaining more counterplay in the center here, and this is known to be pretty good for black. Coming back to this position though, it's also worth noting here that with this tension here on the c and d pawns, it's also not very good if white chooses to release the tension here on this pawn in this exact position. There's probably one opening variation though where this is considered to be quite okay, and it's in this position here after knight c3, knight f6, where white can take here on d5 immediately, because now notice how they haven't played e3 yet, so they can get their bishop out to g5, and here this is a very popular opening variation where concretely it's just kind of known to be good. But generally a lot of the time the c takes d5 move isn't so good, because here, if you notice once again, this bishop is blocked in by the e3 pawn and can't go to this very active g5 square, and hence white's kind of plans are very limited, and it only really benefits black with this kind of recapture of the pawn here on d5. One, the e file is open for the rook to come here later, and also this bishop diagonal has been opened, which means it doesn't have to go to a square like, say, black would play b6, and the bishop doesn't have to go to a square like b7, where it isn't that active, but it's also not terrible. If it goes to a square like g4, that's a lot more active, and for example, we could get this after the position in bishop d3, bishop d6, castle, castle, something like this. How will black activate the bishop now? They can play a move like knight f8, very typical. One of the main purposes of the knight coming here is defend the h7 square actually, so this knight has a bit more freedom. This knight could come to e4 potentially, which is one of the benefits of having the e file open. It's a lot more easy for that kind of plan to become feasible. Also, the bishop will soon be coming to g4 here, and black just has a very nice position here, with all his pieces being very active. Meanwhile, however, this white bishop on c1 doesn't have very good prospects. Alright, so the last example I want to show today is in what we'd call the Fourdoor opening, which occurs after e4, d6, d4, knight f6, knight c3, e5. And to a lot of people this looks really weird because you'd think here after taking here, takes, but this endgame is really good for white, having revoked black's kings of its castling rights here, but that's actually nowhere near the end of the story here. It turns out that this position is very playable for black here, and one interesting position actually is after bishop c4. Black could play king e8 defending the pawn like this, but they could also play a move like bishop e6, simply not giving a crap if white takes here and gives them double pawns. We're going to argue that we can just play a move like bishop d6 here, king e7, defend this pawn here, and this double pawn here on e6 is not even that much of a weakness, it's actually a strength. It controls these very important squares like d5, f5, and we also have like the semi-open f file to compensate for that double pawn as well. Pretty decent position actually. And this whole line actually with d takes e5 and going to this whole endgame, it's actually known to be quite good for black here, and hence a lot of master players, when they are faced with this variation here in this position with e5, they will not play d takes e5. Another very common try at the amateur level is to play d5 here, but again the problem is we kind of discussed in a similar position in the row Lopez, is that here it releases the pressure off the e5 pawn. Even if we're not going to take there immediately, it doesn't mean we have to play d5. We can continue playing moves like knight f3 here, building up the tension, developing our pieces, and this is just kind of what we should do in this position. Whereas after d5, once again, black can play moves like bishop e7, castle, and they can strike back in the center with c6 at any moment they want and attack the d5 pawn here, and they're doing pretty well. So after knight f3, I'm just going to show a few moves, kind of show how you can continue developing the army while also not having to release attention. So after knight b7, bishop c4, you can play moves like this. And here, a lot of people are going to be tempted, like they feel like the castle, they've developed a couple pieces, like, okay, just let me take now on e5. But again, this isn't really something you want to do, because after d takes e5, notice how this d4 pawn, a lot more active than this pawn d6, has been traded off. Now if you look at the central kind of situation here, black and white both have this pawn here on e4 and e5 opposing each other like that. And the situation there is pretty equal, whereas before here, you can clearly see the white has a space advantage here, but they've completely given it up after taking here on e5. And say if after something like queen e2, black's just going to play the moves they were going to play anyway in the sub, where they play c6, queen c7, bring the queen out like that, maybe bring the rook to a square like d8 or e8, develop this knight over to f8, bring to g6 for example. They have a very solid position here. So instead, in this sort of position, something that we'd very often do is bring the rook to e1. It might not have any immediate use here, but in general it's just a decent square for the rook. You never know in the future if the center opens up with something like e takes d4, if this rook could be useful here. So in general, it's just a move that you should play. And here black will probably just continue with their setup as I was describing earlier of queen c7, or c6 and then queen c7 rather. And here we don't want to get kicked around for a move like b5 here, so we play a4, queen c7, and we just try and play useful moves here, 8-3. We don't want to release attention here with a move like d takes e5 again, not something we want to do. Another point is that it opens up the c5 square for the bishop maybe, where it could now go from this rather passive square e7 to a more active square like c5. Not something we want to allow, guys. So h3, b6 for example, not the only move. And here we just kind of continue playing this waiting game here, where we play a move like bishop a2. A little bit of what we'd call prophylaxis. Just removing it from the square, where it could be a little bit vulnerable. On a2 it's very secure, and also just keeping an eye on this diagonal here. And now after bishop b7, this bishop no longer has an eye on this diagonal, so something that very often we will do in such a situation is not take on e5, but rather play a move like knight h4 here, threatening to come into the f5 square here, and this is very dangerous for black. If black tries to play something like g6, we can actually play rather sacrificially here with moves like bishop h6, rook fe8, queen d2. Notice how we finally waited for the right opportunity. Now the g6 pawn was provoked forward for our bishop to leap into the square here at h6 very actively, then bringing our queen to d2, connecting the rook's final complete development. Now for something like rook a d8 here, black can actually play a move like knight f5. This is a sacrifice I was talking about. It's not even really a sacrifice because if black takes it, queen g5 is deadly here, since after king h8, queen g7 is mate. So what black more or less has to play here is bishop f8, exchanging off this very annoying dark sort bishop of ours. And after takes, we can actually finally release attention here on e5, since after d takes e5, we want to play queen g5, but since if we lift our pawn d4, after a move like e takes d4, our knight would have been distracted away from this very active square. But now, after queen g5, g takes f5 is no longer possible, of course, and our pieces are just on very dangerous attacking squares. Maybe knight e7 or knight h6 is going to be coming. Maybe we could bring our rook into a square like e3 to g3, or maybe we can even bring our other knight into like e2 to g3 and somehow make tactics happen from there. Also, I should note throughout this whole variation, there's always been the working possibility of black taking on d4 here. However, if black does that, we'd be happy at any moment because it means after a move like knight takes d4, our pieces are very happy, all on active squares. This knight could come to f5 maybe, we can develop our bishop very freely to a square like f4, we can play queen d2, bring the rooks to the center, and we just have a very nice kind of space advantage here with this e4 pawn playing against the d6 pawn here, while black is kind of stuck to a very kind of passive position. Alright, so thank you for sticking around till the end of the video. I hope you learned something useful. To me, this is one of the topics which really changed my chess a lot, and I think it's one of the most important topics for any kind of aspiring chess player's understanding. But anyways, hope you enjoyed the video. Please like it if you liked it, subscribe to the channel for more content like this, and also comment down below if there's any questions you have about this topic, or any video ideas that you'd like to see me make. Anyways, until next time, I will see you.